Okay, let's get right into this. Most of us, whether we admit it or not, are basically living two completely different lives, right? There's the life that people see, the professional you, the supportive friend, the person who manages to smile at all the right times. And then there is the person who exists the very second your front door clicks shut. We tend to think that the mask is what we show the outside world, but the psychology we're unpacking in this explainer reveals something kind of unsettling. A lot of times the mask is what we show ourselves just to get through the day. What you do when you are completely alone, when the performance finally ends and the silence begins, well, that reveals the hidden blueprints of how you were built. It's in those quiet, unobserved moments that your nervous system finally speaks its honest language. So I want you to really ask yourself, who are you when the front door clicks shut? Because we routinely mistake our private habits for personality flaws. You might wonder why you feel this strange sense of guilt whenever you aren't being productive, or why you catch yourself mentally rehearsing for a conflict that hasn't even happened yet. We casually label these behaviors as anxiety or laziness, but the research suggests they are something much, much deeper. When you're alone, you aren't just being yourself. You are actually revealing the specific traits you had to develop when your world felt unpredictable. As you'll see here on the left, we've got these negative labels we use to punish ourselves, like anxiety, laziness, aloofness. But take a look at the right side. Psychology reframes these completely. They aren't flaws at all. They are profound psychological adaptations. Survival, efficiency, self-reliance. These behaviors are the lingering echoes of a time when you weren't just living, You were surviving, you were adapting to your environment.
Now, what's absolutely fascinating here is the core definition of a psychological adaptation. It's a behavioral change developed to survive an unpredictable or unkind environment. And here's the kicker. It remains active even after the danger is gone. For a lot of people, childhood wasn't exactly a period of safety. It was more like a series of puzzles to be solved. And the solutions your brain came up with, they didn't just magically vanish the day you became an adult.
Let's break down one of these specific blueprints, what we call the ignored child default mode. If you grew up in an environment where your emotional world mostly went unnoticed, your brain formed a core belief that your feelings simply don't matter. And that isn't just a sad thought, it's an actual structural change in how you process the world. You develop this extreme self-sufficiency, not sure independence, but an adaptive response because you learned pretty early on that support might not arrive. You might feel uncertain in relationships, yet, ironically, you become highly aware of other people's emotional shifts. Your brain is constantly monitoring the moods of everyone around you to maintain connection, almost always at the expense of your own needs. Okay, so let's look at how this actually plays out in daily life. This perfectly visualizes the energy distribution of a mind that appears lazy, but is actually deeply ambitious. Look at that. 80% of their energy goes straight into mental planning, anticipation, and evaluation. That leaves only 20% for the actual physical action. So when they're alone, they aren't just sitting there doing nothing. Their mind is working tirelessly before their body even moves. They're constantly evaluating the effort versus the reward, processing these crazy high internal standards, and literally reaching mental fatigue before they've even started a task. From the outside, yeah, it looks like procrastination. But psychologically, it's just a brain trying to protect its limited energy from a world that feels incredibly demanding. And that brings us to a really crucial battle: perfect versus started. Because of that immense mental taxation we just talked about, starting a task feels super risky unless the conditions are absolutely perfect. People with these adaptations delay action not because they don't care, but because they care entirely too much about doing it perfectly. Waiting simply feels safer than starting imperfectly. It's like your brain is hyper-tuned to outcomes rather than the process itself. Or think about the private reality of someone who was just never the first choice growing up. When they think nobody is watching, they definitely don't celebrate their wins loudly. Actually, they might not celebrate them at all. Because they learned early on that support is inconsistent, they adapt by becoming hyper-aware of social signals and tone, even in their own heads. They often overgive in relationships, trying desperately to become irreplaceable, all because they harbor this really deep fear of being quietly swapped out or just seen as temporary. In private, they aren't necessarily lonely. They are practicing a form of silent, resilient independence because long ago, they just stopped expecting a rescue that never came. Which leads us to, honestly, such a fascinating question. Why does a Sunday afternoon feel dangerous? Have you ever noticed that? That you just can't seem to relax when things get quiet? Well, when your brain reverts to its default mode, a period of calm does not mean safety. In your personal history, a period of calm often meant that something was about to go horribly wrong. So your nervous system stays on high alert. What looks to everyone else like an inability to sit still is actually just a brain that has stayed mentally alert for decades, completely unable to trust that the all clear signal is real. A massive driver for this inability to just chill out is a psychological concept called parentification. It happens when a child is forced to take on early responsibility, managing emotions for themselves or for the adults around them way before they are developmentally ready for it. These are the kids who didn't lose their childhood in some big sudden event. They just outgrew it quietly. They realized one day that someone had to be responsible, and, well, it might as well be them. They learned that their own feelings simply had to come last. And all that rushed early responsibility, it creates what psychology calls split maturity. You are exceptionally wise, serious, and responsible on the outside. People rely on you. But on the inside, you feel emotionally unmet, maybe a bit confused and overwhelmingly guilty whenever you need rest or support. You just grew up so incredibly fast that you didn't get the time to learn how to need other people safely. Your emotional development was rushed, leaving some parts way too mature while others remained completely unfulfilled. So, rule number 1 for folks with this blueprint: you trust yourself first. Early hardship pretty much teaches you to prioritize loyalty over affection, simply because early affection was so unstable. Because handling pain alone and solving problems alone were pretty much the only reliable constants you had, you learned to rely on yourself first and foremost. You don't hate help, you just don't trust it to stick around. But here is where we really need to shift our perspective. Everything we've been describing, it isn't a list of damages, not at all. It is a massive testament to silent strength. Surviving disappointment without breaking down because, well, you've seen it before. Research on resilience actually shows that folks who faced chronic social exclusion or early responsibility develop astonishingly high emotional endurance. You can stay totally calm when plans fall apart. Your strength is silent, not loud. So going forward, I really want you to replace the question you usually ask yourself. Stop asking, what is wrong with me? And start asking, what did I have to do to get here? When you look at your private habits through this new lens, the clarity comes in realizing that these aren't flaws. They are profound evidence of your endurance. They are literally the adaptations that kept you alive. This next part is a pretty hard-hitting psychological truth, but we absolutely need to acknowledge it. You learned responsibility before you learned safety, and you learned strength before you learned softness. You didn't get to choose the blueprints you used to build your early safety. You did what you had to do. You became strong because, frankly, there was no other option. But here is the absolute most important takeaway of this entire explainer. The pressure you adopted to, it's just no longer there. You are allowed to rest. Healing doesn't mean you have to break these traits or suddenly become weak. It just means acknowledging that you aren't that child anymore. The patterns in the walls that kept you safe back then, they do not have to define your boundaries today. Once you finally see the pattern, you can stop the blame. So tonight, when the lights are low and the world gets quiet, just pay attention to that version of yourself that surfaces, the one that doesn't need to perform for anyone. If you feel that familiar hum of alertness or the heavy weight of self-reliance creeping in, don't fight it, just acknowledge it, and ask yourself, when you are alone tonight, will you finally let the person nobody watches simply rest?